On the flight from Frankfurt to New York, first-class passengers are laughing and chatting until the emergency lights start flashing red. A powerful female CEO arrogantly lifts her chin, smirking at a man in a worn jacket. He can't do anything. Completely useless. But then, the captain's voice crackles through the speakers, strained and desperate. "We've lost control. Any fighter pilot on board?" The entire cabin falls silent. The quiet man slowly stands up. The CEO's face goes pale as she realizes what he's been hiding all along. How did one underestimated passenger become everyone's only hope? Meet David Keller, 42 years old. A single father with graying brown hair and a weathered face that tells stories he never shares. He's wearing an old jacket that's seen better days, but his eyes hold a calmness that cuts through any storm. David lives in the suburbs of Frankfurt, raising his 11-year-old son, Max, alone. His wife died in a car accident 3 years ago, leaving him to navigate parenthood without a roadmap. Every morning he makes Max's lunch with the same precision he once used for more dangerous tasks. Every evening he helps with homework at their small kitchen table, surrounded by photos of happier times. What no one knows is that David was once a Luftwaffe fighter pilot. He flew Typhoon jets through combat missions that pushed the limits of human endurance. But when his wife died, he made a choice that shocked his commanding officers. He left military service to become a full-time father. Today he's bringing Max to New York to visit the boy's grandmother. They're seated in economy class, their tickets purchased with careful budgeting and months of saving. Across the aisle sits Sophie Brandt, 35 years old, impeccably dressed in an expensive suit that costs more than David's monthly rent. She's the CEO of a major tech corporation, accustomed to boardrooms where her word is law and her presence commands immediate respect. As the plane experiences mild turbulence during takeoff, Sophie notices David instinctively placing a protective arm around his son. She smirks to her business associate. "Look at him," she says, not bothering to lower her voice. "A grown man can't even handle a little airplane movement. What kind of example is that for his kid? Pathetic." David hears every word. His jaw tightens slightly, but he doesn't respond. Instead, he quietly reassures Max, who's gripping his father's hand. "It's okay, buddy. Just a little bump. We'll be flying smooth in a minute." Sophie rolls her eyes. "Men like that accomplish nothing in life. They're just useless." When the plane hits another patch of rough air, several passengers gasp and grip their armrests. David remains perfectly calm, his breathing steady, his posture relaxed. To those watching closely, his stillness seems almost professional. A flight attendant notices his composure. During her routine cabin check, she pauses by his row. "Sir, I have to say, you're handling this turbulence remarkably well. Most passengers get nervous." David gives a modest smile. "I've experienced worse conditions." "Are you a frequent flyer?" "You could say that." The flight attendant moves on, but she makes a mental note in her report later. Passenger Keller in seat 23C demonstrated exceptional calm during severe turbulence, actively comforting his child and reassuring nearby passengers when others were panicking. Sophie overhears this exchange and scoffs, probably just trying to look tough for his kid. When real danger comes, we'll see how calm he stays. Max looks up at his father with admiring eyes. "Dad, were you scared?" David ruffles his son's hair. "When you know what you're doing, there's less to be scared of. But what if something really bad happens?" David's voice is quiet but firm. "Then we handle it, together. That's what families do." Sophie pretends to focus on her laptop, but she's listening. Something about David's tone bothers her. It's not bravado or empty reassurance. It's the voice of someone who has faced real danger and survived. But she dismisses the thought. In her world, power comes from position and wealth. This man in his discount clothing, raising a child alone, represents everything she's fought not to become: ordinary, vulnerable, dependent on others. She has no idea how wrong she is. Sophie Brandt built her empire from nothing. At 35, she commands a tech corporation worth billions, but the corner office feels more like a prison than a palace. Behind her polished exterior lies a woman who sacrificed personal connections for professional success. As the flight continues, the turbulence worsens. The plane shudders and drops suddenly, causing several passengers to cry out. Sophie's knuckles turn white as she grips her armrest, though she tries to maintain her composed facade. David, meanwhile, remains remarkably steady. He pulls out his old jacket and wraps it around Max, who's looking nervous. "Here, buddy. This will keep you warm and safe." Max snuggles into the jacket, immediately calming down. "Dad, why aren't you scared like everyone else?" "Because I've learned that staying calm helps you think clearly, and thinking clearly helps you solve problems." Sophie finds herself inadvertently listening. Despite her earlier mockery, there's something genuinely reassuring about David's presence. When another passenger starts hyperventilating 2 rows ahead, David quietly stands and offers the woman his water bottle and a gentle word of encouragement. The small act of kindness doesn't go unnoticed. Sophie watches as David returns to his seat, not seeking attention or praise, simply doing what felt right. "Dad," Max whispers, "tell me about Mom again." David reaches into his wallet and pulls out a worn photograph. A beautiful woman with Max's smile and David's determined eyes. "Your mother was the bravest person I ever knew," he says softly. "She used to say that we're never really alone when we carry love with us." He hands the photo to Max. "She's flying with us today, buddy. She's always flying with us." Sophie's throat tightens unexpectedly. She recognizes the way David looks at that photograph. The same way she used to look at her own family photos before ambition consumed everything else. "Excuse me," she finds herself saying, her voice softer than usual. Did you ever fly professionally?" David glances at her, surprised by the change in her tone. "Once upon a time." "Commercial aviation?" David's smile is cryptic. "Different kind of flying." Before Sophie can ask more, the aircraft lurches violently to the left. Oxygen masks drop from the ceiling as passengers scream. The lights flicker and then go out completely, leaving only emergency lighting casting eerie red shadows throughout the cabin. The captain's voice comes over the intercom, strained and urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing serious technical difficulties with our flight control systems. We need to make an emergency landing, but first, this is unusual, but is there any fighter pilot on board? We need someone with combat aviation experience immediately." The cabin falls dead silent. 300 passengers hold their breath. Sophie stares at David, her mind racing. Fighter pilot. His earlier comments suddenly make sense. The calm demeanor, the technical knowledge, the way he assessed the turbulence like someone who understood aircraft systems. David looks at Max, then at the terrified faces around him. He stands up slowly, his voice cutting through the silence with quiet authority. "I'm David Keller, former Luftwaffe pilot, Typhoon fighter jets. I have over 2,000 flight hours in combat conditions." Gasps echo through the cabin. Sophie's jaw drops. "Can you help us, sir?" the flight attendant asks urgently. David nods. "I'll do everything I can." As he moves toward the cockpit, Max calls out, "Dad, are you really a hero?" David pauses, looks back at his son, then at Sophie. For the first time since boarding, Sophie sees past his worn clothing and modest demeanor to something else entirely. Competence, courage, and quiet strength. "Your father," Sophie says, her voice barely above a whisper, "is exactly who we need right now." The flight attendant escorts David toward the front of the plane. As they pass Sophie's row, she reaches out and touches his arm. "I'm sorry," she says simply, "for what I said earlier. I was wrong." David nods acknowledgingly. "Just take care of Max if something happens to me." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Sophie replies with surprising conviction. "You're going to save us all." As David disappears into the cockpit, the cabin buzzes with nervous energy. Passengers who moments before had been strangers now huddle together, sharing water, offering comfort, united by their shared vulnerability. Sophie moves to sit next to Max, surprising herself with the gesture. "Is my dad going to be okay?" Max asks, his young voice trembling. Sophie looks at this brave little boy who clearly adores his father, and something inside her chest cracks open. "Your dad is the most capable person on this plane. If anyone can help us, it's him." In the cockpit, David assesses the situation with the cold efficiency of his military training. The primary flight controls are damaged, but the backup systems are still functional. It's a delicate situation requiring precision and experience that only comes from flying in life-or-death scenarios. Meanwhile, one passenger manages to record a short video on his phone before the signal cuts out. David walking into the cockpit with the determined stride of someone who knows exactly what needs to be done. The video will later go viral with the caption, "Single father answers the call at 30,000 feet. But for now, all anyone can do is wait and pray that the quiet man in the worn jacket really is the miracle they desperately need." Among the first-class passengers sits Werner Richter, 58 years old, chairman of a multinational corporation, and a man who measures human worth by bank account balances. He's also Sophie's father, a fact that adds another layer of tension to an already fraught situation. As the plane stabilizes under David's guidance in the cockpit, Richter's voice cuts through the relative calm like a blade. "How convenient," he says with a sneer. "Some unemployed nobody suddenly claims to be our savior." Sophie turns toward her father, her face flushing. "Dad, he's helping save our lives." "Please," Richter waves dismissively. "One lucky guess doesn't make him valuable. Mark my words. When this is over, he'll try to leverage this moment for money or fame. That's what people like him always do." Other passengers shift uncomfortably. The man's cynicism feels particularly ugly in the face of their shared crisis. David emerges from the cockpit, sweat beading on his forehead, his shirt damp from the intensity of the last 40 minutes. He addresses the cabin with calm professionalism. "The situation is under control. We've regained primary systems and will be making an emergency landing in Shannon, Ireland in approximately 20 minutes. Please remain in your seats with seat belts fastened." Relief washes over the passengers. Spontaneous applause breaks out. But Richter isn't finished. "Bravo for the performance," he says, loud enough for everyone to hear. "But don't think this little heroic act changes what you are. Tomorrow you'll still be unemployed. You'll still be nobody special." The cabin falls silent again, but this time it's the silence of shock and disgust. Sophie stands up, her face blazing. "Stop it, Dad. Just stop." "Sophie, don't be naive. Men like this just saved your life," her voice echoes through the cabin. "He saved all of us. Your money couldn't fix those flight controls. Your connections couldn't land this plane safely. But he could, and he did." David remains calm, but there's steel in his voice when he responds. "Mr. Richter, I didn't help because I wanted anything from you. I helped because 300 people needed someone to act, including your daughter." Richter's face reddens. "Don't lecture me about—" "I'm not lecturing anyone." David's voice is steady, unshakable. "But you're wrong about something important. You think money determines a person's value, but money can't fly a plane in a crisis. It can't make life or death decisions under pressure. It can't comfort a frightened child or give hope to desperate people." He glances around the cabin, making eye contact with passengers who are listening intently. Every person on this plane has value. The teacher in row 12 who's been comforting other passengers. The teenager who gave up his phone battery to help an elderly man call his family. The mother who shared her medication with a stranger having a panic attack. That's real wealth. The willingness to help when help is needed. Passengers nod, some wiping away tears. The truth of his words resonates in a way that transcends class boundaries or economic status. Sophie looks at her father with a mixture of shame and defiance. "This is why Mom left you, isn't it? Because you couldn't see past dollar signs to recognize actual human worth." Richter's face crumbles momentarily before hardening again. "Sophie, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. I became exactly like you. Successful, wealthy, and completely alone." She turns to David. I called you useless when we boarded. I judged you by your clothes and your circumstances. But you just proved that character matters more than cash. David's expression softens. Ms. Brandt, we all make assumptions. What matters is what we do when we learn we're wrong. The plane begins its descent toward Shannon Airport. Through the windows, passengers can see emergency vehicles lining the runway, fire trucks, ambulances, news crews. Word has already spread about the crisis and the unlikely hero who helped resolve it. Max tugs on his father's sleeve. Dad, why is everyone looking at you like that? Because your father, Sophie answers, kneeling down to Max's eye level, is exactly the kind of man everyone hopes to be when faced with impossible situations. As the wheels touch down smoothly on the runway, the entire cabin erupts in sustained applause. But David just sits back down next to his son, wrapping him in a gentle hug. We made it, buddy. I knew you would, Dad. You're the best pilot in the world. Richter watches this interaction from across the aisle. For the first time in years, he sees something his money can't buy. The unconditional love between a father and son, built not on what David owns, but on who he is. As passengers prepare to disembark, many approach David to thank him personally. He accepts their gratitude with humility, deflecting praise and emphasizing the crew's professionalism and the passengers' cooperation. But one conversation stands out. An elderly woman takes his hand and says, Young man, you didn't just save our lives. You reminded us that heroes don't always look like what we expect. They look like you, ordinary people who do extraordinary things when it matters most. Sophie overhears this and realizes the profound truth in those words. She spent her entire adult life believing that power and success came from dominance and wealth. But David has just demonstrated a different kind of power entirely, the power that comes from competence, courage, and genuine concern for others. As they finally begin moving toward the exit, Sophie makes a decision that will change her life. Mr. Keller, she calls out. David, would you and Max like to have dinner with me once we get to New York? I'd like to learn more about what real strength looks like. David considers this for a moment, then nods. Max would like that. He doesn't get many chances to see how the other half lives. Maybe, Sophie says quietly. It's time I learned how the better half lives. Even Richter, watching his daughter's transformation, begins to wonder if his own definition of success has been fundamentally flawed all along. The plane doors open, and they step out into a world that suddenly looks different to all of them. Shannon Airport is chaos. News crews have descended like locusts, their cameras and bright lights creating a media circus around what should be a moment of quiet relief. The headline is already writing itself. Single father saves flight 447. David tries to avoid the cameras, holding Max close as they navigate through the terminal. But reporters are persistent. Mr. Keller, can you tell us about your military background? How did you know what to do in the cockpit? Are you planning to return to professional aviation? David pauses, his natural inclination toward privacy warring with the realization that this moment might inspire others. He faces the cameras, Max still tucked protectively under his arm. I did what any trained pilot would do in that situation. The real heroes are Captain Morrison and his crew, who managed an incredibly dangerous situation with professionalism and skill. I was just support. But sir, without your intervention, without everyone's cooperation, David interrupts gently, we wouldn't have landed safely. This wasn't about one person. It was about people working together when it mattered most. Sophie watches from nearby, struck by his refusal to claim sole credit. In her business world, taking maximum credit for success is standard operating procedure. David's humility feels revolutionary. A reporter spots her. Ms. Brandt, as CEO of Brandt Technologies, what was it like to be saved by... It was humbling, Sophie interrupts, her voice clear and strong. Mr. Keller reminded all of us that true competence doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes the most capable people are the quietest ones in the room. The reporter presses further. There are reports that you initially dismiss Mr. Keller's capabilities. Sophie's cheeks flush, but she doesn't dodge the question. I made assumptions based on superficial observations. I was wrong, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to learn from that mistake. Later, after the media frenzy dies down and they've been processed through various debriefings, Sophie approaches David and Max in the quiet corner, where they're waiting for their rescheduled connecting flight. I know this has been overwhelming, she says, but I meant what I said about dinner. When we get to New York, would you both like to stay at my hotel? I have a suite with extra rooms, and Max might enjoy the pool. Max's eyes light up. Dad, can we? She seems nice now. David chuckles at his son's brutal honesty. If Ms. Brandt doesn't mind hosting a couple of budget travelers, Sophie, she corrects. Just Sophie, and I'd be honored. 3 days later in New York, Sophie finds herself in an entirely new world. David and Max's rhythm is simple but profound. Morning cartoons with homemade pancakes. Afternoon walks through Central Park, where Max chases pigeons while David and Sophie talk about everything except business. Tell me about flying, Sophie asks as they sit on a bench watching Max feed ducks. What do you want to know? What made you give it up? David is quiet for a long moment. When Maria died, Max needed stability more than I needed adrenaline. Military life is demanding. Constant deployments, training exercises, missions that can't be discussed. I realized that being the best father I could be was more important than being the best pilot I could be. Do you miss it? Sometimes. But then Max shows me a drawing he made, or tells me about his day at school, or asks me to help with his homework, and I know I made the right choice. Sophie watches Max attempt to befriend a particularly stubborn duck. I've never had that kind of certainty about anything. I built my company because I was good at it, but I'm not sure I've ever done anything that truly mattered. You employ thousands of people, David points out. That matters. Does it? Or am I just another wealthy person making other wealthy people wealthier? That evening in Sophie's penthouse suite, she watches David help Max with his math homework at the dining room table. The scene is so domestic, so genuinely warm, that it brings tears to her eyes. She realizes she's been living in a beautiful cage, surrounded by luxury but isolated from authentic human connection. David and Max, with their modest means but rich emotional bonds, possess something she'd never thought to pursue: contentment. Sophie, Max calls out, do you know how to play Uno? No, I don't think I've ever played. Dad, Sophie doesn't know Uno. We have to teach her. And so she finds herself sitting on the floor, learning a card game that costs $3 from two people who are teaching her lessons worth infinitely more. When David eventually puts Max to bed in the sweet second bedroom, Sophie sits alone on her balcony overlooking the city lights. For the first time in years, the view doesn't feel like a symbol of conquest. It feels like a reminder of how far removed she's become from the world below. David joins her on the balcony with 2 cups of coffee. Thank you, she says simply. For what? For showing me what I've been missing, for reminding me that success without connection is just expensive loneliness. David looks out at the skyline. It's never too late to change course. I should know. I've done it myself. Is that an invitation? It's a reminder that family doesn't have to be just blood relations. Sometimes it's the people who choose to stay when they could easily walk away. Sophie considers this as the city sparkles beneath them, feeling for the first time in years that she might actually be home. 6 months after Flight 447, David receives an offer that changes everything. A major commercial airline wants him as their chief flight training instructor. The salary is substantial, the position prestigious, and the work would utilize all of his hard-earned expertise. But there's a catch. The job is based in Seattle, requiring him and Max to relocate across the country. Sophie has become a regular part of their lives during these months. She visits their modest Frankfurt apartment weekly, bringing books for Max and staying for dinner. She's learned to cook simple meals, play board games, and listen to Max's elaborate stories about school adventures. More importantly, she's been transforming her business philosophy. Under her guidance, Brandt Technologies has launched several initiatives focused on social impact rather than pure profit. Employee satisfaction is up, community engagement has increased, and Sophie finds herself energized by work that feels meaningful. But now David's opportunity threatens to separate them just as they found something none of them expected: a chosen family. "Take the job," Sophie tells him when he shares the news. They're sitting in his small kitchen while Max does homework at the same table where they've shared countless meals. It's an amazing opportunity. "It means leaving everything here, everyone." Sophie tries to keep her voice steady. "I'll visit. We'll stay in touch. Max needs to see his father succeed at the highest level." But her heart is breaking as she says it. That evening, after Sophie has gone home, Max approaches his father with unusual seriousness. "Dad, are you going to take the Seattle job?" "I don't know yet, buddy. What do you think?" "I think Sophie would be really sad if we left." David looks at his son with surprise. "Why do you say that?" "Because she looks at us the way I look at chocolate cake, like we're the best thing ever. But she's not sure she's allowed to have us." The wisdom of children never ceases to amaze David. "And how do you feel about Sophie?" "I like her a lot. She's not like a mom, but she's like family that chose us instead of being stuck with us." 2 weeks later, David makes his decision, but instead of announcing it to Sophie over dinner, he orchestrates something more meaningful. He invites Sophie to Max's school play, a production of Peter Pan, where Max plays one of the lost boys. As they sit in the cramped auditorium surrounded by other families, Sophie realizes this is the first school event she's ever attended for anyone. After Max's performance, he forgets 2 lines but recovers admirably. They walk back to David's apartment through the quiet Frankfurt streets. "Sophie," David says, stopping under a streetlight, "I turned down the Seattle job." "David, no. You can't sacrifice that opportunity for—" "I'm not sacrificing anything. I'm choosing something better." He takes her hands. "I spent years thinking that success meant climbing higher, going faster, achieving more. But you and Max taught me something different." "What's that?" "That the best life isn't necessarily the biggest life. It's the life that makes room for the people you love." Sophie's eyes fill with tears. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying that if you're interested in being part of a small, slightly chaotic family that plays too much Uno and makes terrible homemade pizza, we'd love to have you." Max, who has been pretending not to listen, suddenly appears beside them. "Does this mean Sophie gets to stay? Like, permanently?" David looks at Sophie, waiting for her answer. "I can't think of anywhere else I'd rather be," she says. Later in their apartment, Max carefully places a small model airplane on the mantelpiece next to his mother's photograph. It's not replacing anything. It's completing something that was always meant to be larger than just 2 people. Family, they've learned, isn't about blood or obligation. It's about the people who show up consistently, who choose to stay when staying gets difficult, and who love you not for what you achieve, but for who you are. If you believe stories like this remind us what truly matters in life, please leave a comment and subscribe to our channel. We share stories that shouldn't be forgotten, stories about ordinary people who do extraordinary things, and about love that finds a way even when the odds seem impossible.